Welcome back to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In this video we're going to look at the present passive and middle indicative, and you should have already watched the video on the present active indicative because this form is going to be almost exactly the same. It just has different endings. Rather than having the primary active endings o, es, e, omenete, usi, it's going to have the primary passive personal endings. So my, sai, tai, methus, they, ontai, which we'll see here in a second. So aside from that, everything's still the same. We're in the indicative mood. It's describing something factual. It's asking a question or it's stating an opinion. We're still using the imperfective aspect, presenting the action as in progress, as a progress, or presenting the action as unfolding before your eyes, something like that. Everything about the tense stem that we said before still applies. Now, the passive and middle are voices. So that with the passive, that means that the subject is being acted upon. So something like the ball was being thrown, that's the ball is the subject, and it is actually receiving the action of being thrown. Middle voice is difficult to describe in English because we don't really have a corresponding category. But it's with middle verbs, they typically have an active sense, at least as we translate them into English. They have an active sense, but generally the meaning is going to have to be consulted in a lexicon. You're just going to have to look up the word in a lexicon, a Greek dictionary, to figure out what that word actually means in the middle voice. Sometimes it's very similar to the active meaning, sometimes it's completely different. So you just have to look it up. There's still some ongoing debate about the middle voice, how to talk about it, how to understand it, so I don't enter into that here at all. But there are some other resources you can find that talk about the middle voice. Now, in the present tense, the passive and the middle voice share the same conjugation. That's not the case with other tense stems like the aorist, but in this case, with the present tense, they do share the same conjugation. So, when you see a middle or passive form in the present indicative, you're going to have to decide from context whether that's middle or passive. And generally, it's pretty obvious whether it's middle or passive. Sometimes it's not, and it takes a little interpretation to figure it out, but that's all part of the process. Lastly, verbs that appear in only a passive or a middle form but have an active meaning are called deponent verbs. Two common examples are poruomai, meaning to go, and erkomai, meaning to come, or I come. Now notice that those don't end in omega, like echo or luo. They have the middle or passive endings here. Scholars usually parse these as middle. And they've traditionally been called deponent. As I said, there's some discussion on the middle voice, and the deponent is especially part of that discussion. Some people are calling for dropping the label deponent altogether. The new Baylor handbook series, Handbooks on the Greek New Testament, they've systematically decided to drop the label deponent, and there are some articles out there arguing for doing such, but basically historically these have been called deponent because they're middle in form but active in meaning. So I'm going to retain the label deponent with the caveat that a lot of scholars are actually calling to drop that label now, but until that's basically settled, we're just going to go ahead and use that term. Now if we look at the paradigm, what we'll see is we'll look at the present passive first. We'll see that you have the same stem, the present tense stem, lu in this case, but if it were blepo, say it would be blep. For balo, it would be ball with two lambdas. Then you have the omicron epsilon connecting vowel, and then you have the personal endings, and so this is really about the only thing that changes here. My, sai, tai, methus, they, ontai. These are easy to say out loud. They kind of, the first three rhyme, so that's helpful. And then notice that the third plural is the same as the third singular with a nu added onto it. Metha and sthe are also going to be used for the secondary middle and passive endings, so you'll see those again. So those are pretty strong endings that occur in both the primary and the secondary tenses. So when you get to the final forms, you just add these together. Luamai, here's the only one that's strange, lue. So what's going on here? You can see down in the footnote here, the form luasai is what it would be, but it contracts. Because the sigma is between an epsilon and an alpha, or rather a whole diphthong there, the I, because it's between two vowels and it's been added as part of the ending, it's going to drop out. So when it drops out, you're left with luei, which is just unpronounceable and unacceptable. So the vowels, the I, are all going to contract, with ea contracting to a in the iota subscripts. So you have luei, then the epsilon alpha contracts to an eta, and you still have the iota there. And then that iota does not want to hang out on the end, so it just goes and hides under the eta, and you're left with luei. So the actual ending is psi, but then when it contracts, this is what it ends up looking like in the final form. So whenever you memorize the personal endings, you should write, every time, you should write psi, and then in parentheses, write eta with a subscript, iota subscript. That helps you remember the contracted form, because you could confuse this for a lot of things. For example, a dative noun, something like that. So you need to be able to know where that comes from and be able to recognize it when you see it. Now moving down to the present middle deponent indicative. Let me tab down a little here so I can get this all on the screen. All on screen keyboard there. Okay. Now what we have here is erkomai, which is a very common middle deponent indicative verb. And you can see the stem, the present tense stem, all the way down, erk. And then you add the omicron epsilon connecting vowels, and then you add the endings. Now the only thing different here, the reason why this is deponent, is because erkomai is actually the lexical form. There is no form such as this, meaning to come with an active meaning. That does not exist. It's just erkomai. So it's deponent because it has this middle form with an active meaning, meaning to come. So it's the same thing all the way down. Erke, erkatai, erkomatha, erkestha, erkontai. So that's deponent. So essentially this is pretty simple. If you already know the present active indicative, all you have are different personal endings. And as far as the translation, here you see it's just it could be I am coming or I come, depending on the context and how you're going to end up translating it. Up here with the present passive, I am being loosed. I've tried to express the imperfective aspect with this progressive being loosed rather than I am loosed. But it's usually going to be present tense time, not always, but generally. So that's why I've put it in the present tense time there. I am being loosed rather than I was being loosed or I will be being loosed, something like that. So a simple progressive passive translation is all I've used here. You are being loosed. He is being loosed. It could also be I am loosed. You are loosed, something like that. All depends on the context and the word that's the lexeme, the word that's being used, and some other factors. That's all tied up with aspect and translation. So that's it. This is the present passive and middle indicative. Remember, this is the actual formation, the constituent parts up here. You've got the present tense stem, the omicron epsilon variable connecting vowel, and then the primary passive, you could even say middle or passive, primary, middle, passive, personal endings. Mai sai tai, meta sthe, ontai. Remember to say those out loud, write them down, put these different forms on flashcards if you like to do that. Do whatever you need to do to get this memorized. That's it for this video. Join us again next time.